Hey everyone, welcome back to Immeasurably More. I'm your host, Noelle Tomko, and on today's episode of our podcast, we are going to have a conversation with Abby Begley, and she's going to be sharing things about a period in her time that really remind us of we can only be so prepared as human beings, that we know and believe that God is in ultimate control, but what happens and how do we respond when we feel the bottom has fallen out of our lives, or if we're in a situation that is crisis? And she walks us through the healing of that over the past 9 years and just the deeper understanding of what God brought her and her family through the birth of their son. And also just a little bit of a warning for our listeners: if you or someone close to you has experienced pregnancy or child loss, this episode does make reference to that, so we would just like you to know that beforehand. We appreciate you guys listening, and please don't forget to like, comment, and share the podcast. Thanks. Hi, Abby.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I have been thinking a lot since you and I had the conversation about, kind of today's episode, and it's interesting how much even God has been teaching and speaking to me about your experience. And even though I have no personal experience like yours, he's been speaking to me in ways about faithfulness and about how even sometimes when the outcome is not positive, his faithfulness in that did not change. And I've thought about that so many times, about what you guys walked through and what you saw others walking through while you were there. And I am really looking forward to other people hearing, because this is really going to be your first time sort of outwardly processing this in a public way.
Yeah.
And, this isn't an event for you guys that happened in the past couple months. This is, almost 9.
Yeah.
Almost 9 years
ago. Yeah.
And over that 9 years, I'm not sure if you would agree with this, but I'm sure your view of what happened has deepened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of walk through those steps a little bit.
Okay.
Now, as I mentioned in the intro, we talk about things that to some, especially maybe those who are nearing birth, can be a little bit scary, but we won't spend a whole lot of time, on that aspect. It's more about how was God showing up for Abby during those moments, and how is he showing up for your husband and your family who was sitting there waiting for answers, not knowing what was going on. So if you can kind of just start there about how things really are kind of ordinary until they're not. Yeah. If you wouldn't mind walking us through that.
Yeah. So we were having our second son, Jackson, and we had a plan to go in and have a scheduled surgery like I had with my first son. So we were prepared for that because we'd walked through it before. So we knew that. What we weren't prepared for was, like, during his birth, what was going to come about that. Yeah. And what it was is, I'm not a medical professional, so I'll pronounce it wrong, but it was like, basically he ingested fluid. It's something syndrome, but I don't remember what it's called. But he ingested fluid during the C-section. And so that tends to happen with, like, C-section babies. His was just a lot, so much so that, like, he stopped breathing. Like, they had him, they always have, like, the father cut the cord or whatever, which doesn't actually happen when you have a C-section. But anyway, so they had Jackson over there, Aaron was over there, and he's not breathing. And so we hear, like, the nurse say, "Come on, buddy." And then, I hear Aaron say, "Come on, buddy." And I'm like, what is going on?
And you sort of feel the energy in the room shift.
Absolutely.
Right? Especially since you had already had an experience of a surgery to compare it to.
Yes.
Like, the sounds are not the same.
Yeah.
The reactions are not the same.
Yeah.
And as you're sitting there physically and literally unable to move and do anything, that has to feel like torture.
Oh yeah. It was, I don't even know how to describe it. It was, like, horrific. So obviously there's a team with me, because it's surgery. Sure. And then there's a team with Jackson, and they, my doctor yells to the nurse the nurse had just said he's not breathing. And so my doctor then says, "Push the button," which I'm like, what is that? Like, what's happening? And so they push, which is an emergency call button, I guess. And then the room's just flooded with, like, doctors and nurses and, like, people taking care of him. And so they threw, I don't know how long. I'm sure it was only a matter of minutes, but it felt like a lot longer. They did get the fluid out of his lungs. they did get him breathing mostly on his own. He had to be on a CPAP machine. So that was the bulk of like the thing that happened. Like I said, it was only a matter of minutes. It felt like an eternity. And then after that, it was 6 days in the NICU of oxygen levels going up, oxygen levels going down. You know, we always, once we got to the NICU, we always trended positive, but it was still 6 days of up and down and up and down.
Yeah. And every down feels like,
it's horrible.
What does this mean?
Yeah.
And you're in a neonatal intensive care unit, which means that there are other outcomes around you that are not good.
Yeah.
And so I think it's natural for us to try to compare, or take stock to what's around us and be like, well, am I going to be another one of those?
Yeah.
Or has there been so much bad today that mine's going to be good? You know, I think that's, especially as moms, because we want so badly to care for, it's almost like we're trying to prepare our minds.
Yeah.
Right. You had shared with me that while all this is happening, right, like this few minutes that did feel like an eternity.
Yeah.
And you cannot do anything. And your husband rightfully is with your son and all these doctors and nurses and these teams of people. I think when we look at it after and as outsiders, knowing, I mean, I just saw him walk in here. I know how this story ends. We can look at it and think, oh gosh, scary, and kind of move on. It's kind of like how I think we read the gospel is when the disciples are doubting or when they're doing something that we are, as the reader, are thinking, you shouldn't do that. You should have trusted.
Yeah.
Well, it's really impossible for us to put ourselves in their shoes, having them be the first ones to live it.
Yeah.
We know the outcome because we've read it. They didn't.
Right.
And so while you're laying there, you do not know what's going to happen with you, your baby. You can't see, you can't sit up. But God showed up for you in the form of this anesthesiologist.
Yeah. So, and I just, when I look back at it, I was, if there's like a favorite moment of like a bad situation, like this was it. There was this anesthesiologist who was just great. The whole day he was great, like the whole process. But when all the doctors and the nurses are over there with Jackson, like getting the fluid out of his lungs, he so graciously and calmly just knelt down beside me and was like, this is what's happening to him. Like very practical. This is what's happening to him. He said what the syndrome was, Marconium something or other. He said what it was, and then he said, this is what they're doing. You know, they're getting the fluid out of his lungs. This is how they're doing it.
He was your eyes.
Yes. And he was very calm, and he was very like gentle with me and just explained step by step everything that was happening. And in like all of this chaos, he was like an anchor, you know what I mean? And it's just God's being gracious and providing me what I needed, so my mind's not like spiraling out of control with, you know, worst case scenarios.
Sure.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talked about this off air, but one of the things that really struck me after talking with you and just sort of thinking about this story was, you know, I know you and I've had the pleasure of spending time with you and kind of know like your personality and how divine it was that God spoke through this man in a language you relate to.
Yes.
Because you are very calm and very practical and very step by step.
Yes.
And not keen to hysteria.
No,
and,
not really.
You know, this man was not cold with you. He let you know, he was your eyes.
Yeah.
And I thought just how loving that was, that God, you know, was able to say, okay, go tend to her. We have no idea if this man is a believer. We have no idea, if he is, if he knows the impact he had on you that day. But, to be spoken to in a way that you relate to and responded to is in a traumatic event is so needed.
Yes.
And in a situation where you very easily could have been tossed around by the waves, for him to be your anchor was
because he didn't have
incredible.
To. He didn't have to do that. That wasn't his job, you know.
Right. He could have continued with a crossword puzzle or
absolutely. He could just been back there knitting for, you know what I mean? He could do whatever he wants. But he, you know, maybe he'd walked through that before and he knew, you know. But I mean, it was just God. God knew what I needed. He knew I didn't need to be coddled. You know what I mean? I needed to know what was going on, like practically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that part about your story. Yeah. You know, we talk about these situations that, you know, we know as believers, right? Like we're not in control. But on a day-to-day, I think it's fair to say that a lot of us feel like we are in control. I mean, we are like, well, I'm driving to work. I'm responsible for picking up my children. And that very much feels like control.
Yeah.
And then the bottom comes out. And there's really in all the preparation you can do for birth or any surgery, you can't be prepared for a moment like that.
Yeah.
Because how could you until you've lived it, right? So how did your faith, because you've been a believer, I mean, really your whole life.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
How did your faith impact those very first few moments? And when I say moments, obviously they're in the operating room, but even as he is in one place and you're being wheeled to another.
Yeah.
You guys are not together. Did you sort of clock into your faith at that point and try to just be with Abby and God, to be like, tell me what's going on?
Yeah.
Tell me this is going to be okay.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
I would say, like, going into it, we thought we knew what we were doing because we'd done it before. But obviously you can't prepare for a situation like that. You can't say, we know the outcome of this situation, especially when it's high anxiety. There's fear, there's stress. Like in myself, no, we can't be prepared for that. But also, yes, your faith does prepare you for that. Not prepare. I shouldn't say prepare me. Like, God's prepared, so we're prepared. You know, when I look back, like, this situation wasn't a surprise. Like, God knew what was going to happen that day. He knows past, present, future. Like, he knew what was going to step by step happen with Jackson. Yeah. So in that sense, we were prepared because he was with us. He was our comfort. He prepared
the way.
Yeah, he prepared the way. He was our comfort. He was our peace. So, we just, focused on him and relied on him. And, we didn't know what the outcome was going to be in certain periods of that day. But as in our human selves, no, we weren't prepared, but we had God by our side.
Right.
So he walked with us and he carried us.
As I have walked as a Christian, and not nearly as long as you have, or a lot of my friends have, with having been raised in the church or themselves just believing, for as long as they have. I look back at traumatic circumstances, because we all have them, and it's interesting to me to see how long it took me to get to that place of, I don't need to fear. Sometimes I'm like, whoa, that was pretty quick.
Yeah.
Like, good for me.
Yeah.
I only feared for a second.
Yeah.
But there was always some sort of fear.
Yeah.
I have not been in an event so far in my life since knowing Christ where my initial thought during a crazy period was not fear. I always came back to him and then felt comforted.
Yeah.
But there was like these free-falling moments where I was terrified, and I was thinking, this can't be. And for some families, as you guys were waiting, that was their reality.
Yeah.
And I know you talked about one family in particular that you know nothing about. But while your son is in the NICU and you're, looking forward every day to, well, they might release us, we might be able to go home, he's doing better, he's having these positive outcomes. They did not get to leave the hospital with their baby.
Yeah.
What sort of, during this whole process, what sort of scriptures were you guys clinging to as a couple and as parents of this little boy?
Yeah. So I've probably since like my early 20s, like Matthew 6:33 has been like my verse. Because I think for me in my life, it's like, it's the solution to every problem. So seek first the kingdom of God and he will give all these things to you. Yeah. You won't answer all your prayers, but he will give you everything you need.
Right.
So to me, that's the answer for everything. Seek God, seek him first. Like, what do you want me to know? What do you want me to do, God? You're like, I want your will. I want your outcome. And then provide to me, the strength, the endurance, and everything that I need. So particularly in that time frame, that was a verse that we clung to, I would say, because we had to know he was in this with us, because if he's in it with us, we're going to get through it. Yeah. Positive or negative outcome, we were going to get through it.
I think this is such it's an interesting question about faithfulness, that so many times when we hear something, it will be, well, I got this diagnosis, but God was faithful and I no longer have it. I think it's easy to gloss over his faithfulness even when it's not the outcome we wanted. You know, and God's faithfulness to that family who did not get to leave the hospital with their child, his faithfulness was not any different.
Right.
The moment was, right? The experience was, but he wasn't.
Yeah.
He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So it's not that, you know, and I'm saying this more to the listener, it's not that we're saying that because Abby and Aaron believed so strongly that God blessed them with Jackson being okay.
Yeah.
It was that he knew what the outcome was going to be before you went in that day.
Yeah.
And that in life, there's going to be times when that prayer that we pray is not answered. I mean, we have a lot of people in our church right now that are going through excruciating times.
Yeah.
We don't know what that outcome will be. He will. Maybe they'll be what they ask for. Maybe they won't. We have no idea. And I think if we just continually come back to who he is, it helps us in those moments. But you had experienced a bit of survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
You know, for lack of a better term, where you kind of were like, why us?
Yeah.
Where did that come from, do you think, now looking back on it? And how did you work through that?
Yeah. So initially, I think it came from being like in the NICU and seeing, you know, I'm holding my baby. And at this point, we know he's coming home with us. We don't know when, but we know he's coming home with us, you know, and hearing, you know, other families be told like they're going to have to go home without their baby, which is heart-wrenching. Like I can't even explain how heart-wrenching like that is to hear. And so it set this thing in me, like, why did we get to bring our baby home and like they don't, you know? And I know God is all knowing and he's all powerful. And I don't want to understand God to that extent, because then I could be God, you know?
Right.
Like if I can understand his ways and his working, then I could do his job, and we don't want,
Right.
you know, Abby doing that. But yeah, that's when it initially hit. And then I would say like fast forward to like the first, you know, it wasn't my first Mother's Day, but it was my first Mother's Day with Jackson. Everything just felt off, you know, like I'm used to doing like these like Mother's Day banquets and like these sort of like celebrations with lots of people. And there's nothing wrong with those, but it felt off to me.
It changed it for you.
Yeah, it absolutely did. Because then it's like all like that mom was like right in the front of my brain. And then like all the...
Was it more the wondering like, how is she today?
Yeah. Like what is she... Like this day is hard for her. Like this is probably a horrible day for her. And then it's like all of my friends at the time who were like struggling with like infertility.
Yeah.
You know, other people who had lost kids, you know, people who lost their moms. Like all of these like feelings were like right on the surface. And so like, now over time, like, you know, like that eased up. But I think what it did is it gave me a new perspective on like motherhood and fatherhood for that matter. Like parenting is like joy and pain, you know what I mean? Depending on your circumstances.
Most of the time within the same hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so it's just, I think what it taught me was to be more aware of like, we don't know what's going on in people's lives. You know what I mean? A smile hides 1,000 things. And so it just made me be more aware and more gracious and like more kind, you know, especially particularly Mother's Day, like just thinking of those people, you know, who didn't have the outcome that we did.
That have empty arms on Mother's Day.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I think the ordinary, right, of for people who have not struggled, and I want to definitely stress this, for those who have not walked through infertility, that have decided to have a baby and had a baby.
Yeah.
Or who, quote, accidentally had one, maybe in not the greatest circumstances where they were like, well, it wasn't supposed to be this easy, right? I think we can kind of take for granted, well, it's just pregnancy and childbirth. We have our baby, we go home. It's just, you know, most of the time it works out the way you think it's going to work out.
Yeah.
And then when it doesn't, the plans that individual had, they don't just disappear. The hopes for that child's future do not go away. Your hopes for what your life is going to look like over the next 50 years, they don't just disappear.
No.
Those are things they have to be worked through. What I think is so great of God is that he allows us this depth of feeling to become empathetic to others.
Yeah.
Because without that, we cannot relate at all to each other. You know, I have not shared in your experience, but I can share in the experience of I know what it's like to feel like the bottom has given out.
Yeah.
And so my suffering was not the same as your suffering, but it was suffering.
Yeah.
Right. And it is no matter how momentary. But for these moms who do leave the hospital, or these fathers who do leave the hospital without their child and without their wives, it brings on this whole new sense of awareness. Yeah. And I think if we look at the Christian life, that's really a big part of it, is that he's constantly opening our eyes and removing these scales to things that we did not know existed. The guilt part, you know, you hear about this a lot, like survivor's guilt. You hear it, you know, I hear it most in like men who come back from war.
Yeah.
You know, and why me? Why did I survive that and 5 of my buddies didn't? Why did that, you know, truck right in front of me get obliterated and we didn't? Like, why? And it's this heaviness that I think can really be robbed by the enemy, because we know guilt and condemnation are not from God. But it is this heaviness of something that now we feel almost like we should carry.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like, well, if I just hold on to this, then I'm remembering those people, or I'm remembering their loss. And it doesn't go away right away. Yeah. It really is like a working through with Jesus that we have to do to get to an understanding of what it was he was trying to show us.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Because it took time, you know, like I would say today, 9 years after, I don't feel the weight of that as much as I did, but I still feel for those moms and dads and who, like grandmas, who have to live this day, and they don't really want to celebrate, you know, these days. Sure.
I learned that a lot in the work that I did with pregnancy. You know, working in a pregnancy center as long as I did, you see so many outcomes, so many. You see literally someone from every walk of life. In one room, you can have someone who's been struggling to get pregnant for 20 years. In another room, you have someone who's 15 and had sex for the first time and is pregnant.
Yeah.
And you really sit there and start to think about children and motherhood in a whole new light. And one of the things that I've realized is that, you know, Jesus refers to children as a blessing and as a reward. But so many times on this side of heaven, we trade viewing it as a blessing for a burden, and how quickly it can become burdensome in our lives.
Yeah.
And if we're not careful to, as you said, really concentrate on the joy of that.
Yeah.
The bad days, the hard days, the attitude days really drag us into a place that I don't think we're meant to dwell.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're supposed to rejoice in the Lord. And if he gives us those things, then that's rejoicing in the Lord.
Yeah.
Now, that's not as easy. You know, when I go home tonight and I'm struggling with bedtime, I don't know that every second I'm going to think, this is so joyful.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
yeah.
It's definitely a great reminder and a lesson, which is huge.
Yeah.
So how would you say God has healed you of that guilt you felt?
Time, I would say, has, you know, over the course of time. I think his comfort, his reassurance, you know, is always there. But looking at particularly like celebrating Mother's Day or whatever, like there is joy in that day. Like I love the cards and stuff that come home from school. Like I remember mom saying that before I had kids, and I was like, I don't want that stuff. You know what I mean? But now I do. Like, I love when they come home with the things that say, you know, I love when you make me hot dogs and apples or something. But I love that. So I think balancing the joy of it and like being conscious of the pain of it, you know, because it's like, it's both and, you know, joy and pain can live together. So I just think it's continually like walking in that and being comfortable with that and being okay with both, you know,
accepting them both.
Yes.
Yeah. Knowing that, you know, it's our guarantee as believers in Christ, especially to like, there are going to be days and times and seasons and years, potentially decades, that are horrible.
Yeah.
That's a guarantee. But, you know, then you fill in the rest of the story. So what encouragement do you think it would be important for us as believers, or comfort, I guess would be a better word, for us to sort of keep in mind for those people in our lives who didn't get the same outcome as us? You know, if we are, say, a woman or, you know, a couple that is very close friends with another couple that is not getting that baby that they've prayed for, or that had a pregnancy that ended in loss. How can we be better comforters or shepherds of what God might want us to do with that heaviness?
Yeah, I would say like practically, like if you're practically with that person, what I normally tend to do is like, it's just your presence, you know, like, I'm so sorry this happened. I think your presence is enough. I think our words, like our words fall short to actually give somebody, you know what I mean, the peace that they need. So I would direct people towards God's words, you know, like he tells us he's close to the brokenhearted. You know, he tells us that he is our peace. He is our comfort. So I would tend to like give them like scripture, you know, especially if they're a believer. You know, if they're not a believer, I think you can still give them scripture. Sure. Maybe just
sometimes your presence, like you said, is just the peace that they need.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think if you're just with the person, you know, you don't have to take them a meal or anything like that. I think that brings a lot of comfort to them, because if somebody's going through something like that, I feel like time, like, I don't think that kind of pain is healed. God can, absolutely, but I don't think it's healed instantly. So I think it's just time with God, you know, and he'll draw near to them, and, you know, he'll bring them that peace and that comfort continually over and over.
We were talking, not you and I, there was a group of us talking, this was probably about a week ago now, and we were talking about that subject of healing. And it's been sort of a process I've been working on from like a student perspective for, I would say, about the past year and a half, heavily. And it's weird to say that I just now started looking at it as a student, because I've dealt in it, you know, a quote, healing ministry for so long. But I needed to learn something new about it. And I just kept being drawn back to all these examples of when Jesus healed somebody. And they were all the same. They were all immediate. But it doesn't take away the human process of understanding. We know his healing is immediate. It doesn't mean that everything leading up to that moment of healing has just reconciled and we don't have any questions and we don't have any aftermath. These things that we have to then work through alongside with him, right? Grieving, I think, is one of those things that is so hard to comprehend and understand, because it doesn't have an end, really. I mean, a lot of people who have had a significant loss say that the grieving has continued their whole lives. Yeah. And I think that you can still worship and grieve. And I think we'd be remiss to say that you can't. Right. You know, you can't you're not always going to be stuck in grieving. Right. That's not what he wants for us. We have to recognize that we can do both, and we can kind of walk side by side with both. But being there for people is what he did, you know, and if we just model that same thing to just be with them and be that presence of peace, whether believer or not, that's sometimes all he's asking us to do. Yeah. You know? Yeah. Just go sit with somebody who's grieving or who's had a loss or any, you know, whatever the circumstances, just sit with them. Like, you don't have to have the words, right? You know? Yeah. And when there's time for them, he'll give them to you. Yeah. And just for us to be sensitive to that. Yeah. I appreciate that. I like that reminder of just being somebody's, you know, peace. So I'm so thankful that you decided to, first of all, share your story with me. I know that that's not something that you had done with a lot of people. So I do feel very privileged that you trusted me with it. And I'm happy for you, in a sense, that you are at a place now where you can talk about it. Yeah. You know, and that it doesn't still have this very, kind of heavy connection to it. Yeah. That silences people sometimes. Right. Yeah. You know, I've heard from several women in the church that have pretty traumatic experiences, maybe not even just in childbirth, but just as women or with their children, you know, and it's nice to know that we're not alone. Yeah. And it's also nice to know that if somebody were to go through that, it's like, hey, have you spoken with so-and-so? Because they've been where you are, and they might be able to encourage you through this, or just be your friend. Yeah. Which I think is huge for us to do in the church. So I appreciate you talking with me about it. Yeah. And until next time, thanks for listening.